Beneath the desert light of dawn, the pyramids of Giza still stand exactly where they were raised, while modern Cairo spreads across the horizon behind them, its towers and traffic pressing right up to the edge of stone that has outlasted every government that has ever tried to rule this land. It is tempting to look at those monuments and imagine an ancient Egypt that never changed, a civilization frozen in granite and gold. But rewind past the stone, past the golden masks and painted tombs, back more than 5,000 years, and the monuments vanish. The cities vanish. What remains is a narrow green corridor cut through an unforgiving desert, and along its banks, small farming communities that have not yet imagined a pharaoh, let alone a pyramid. From those communities would eventually rise a state capable of organizing thousands of workers, quarrying stone, collecting taxes, inventing a system of writing, and constructing some of the largest buildings the ancient world would ever see. Two kingdoms would become one. Foreign rulers would one day sit on an Egyptian throne, wearing an Egyptian crown. A pharaoh would abandon the gods his ancestors had worshipped for over 1,000 years, and Egyptian soldiers would march farther beyond the Nile than any of their ancestors had dared imagine. Centuries later, a queen named Cleopatra would stand at the edge of a Roman world that was closing in around her. The question this story has to answer is a simple one with a complicated answer. How could the same civilization lose its political unity again and again, and still rebuild itself every time without losing the identity that made it Egyptian? To understand that, the story has to return to a time before pharaohs, before Giza, before Egypt was a kingdom at all. In the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, no single nation called Egypt yet existed, only a scattering of farming villages strung along a river that flooded with astonishing regularity. Each year, the Nile rose, deposited a fresh layer of dark, fertile silt across the fields, and receded, leaving behind soil so productive that a narrow strip of land in the middle of a desert could sustain a growing population. The river was not only farmland, it was also a highway, connecting communities that would otherwise have been isolated by sand and stone. That combination, predictable water and easy movement, allowed people to settle in greater numbers than the surrounding desert could ever support elsewhere. As villages grew, their harvests began producing more grain than any single household could consume, and that surplus needed to be stored, guarded, and distributed. Managing that surplus required people whose job was organization rather than farming. Officials, craftsmen, and local rulers who could coordinate labor and resources across an entire community. Wealth accumulated unevenly, and with it came the first true social hierarchies of the Nile Valley. As these societies grew more complex, they needed a way to track ownership, tribute, and trade that did not depend on memory alone. And toward the end of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, a system of written symbols began to emerge along the river. Writing meant that authority no longer had to be physically present to be enforced. A record could travel where a ruler could not, and a state could begin to grow beyond the reach of a single leader's voice. As competing regional rulers in the north and south of the Nile Valley expanded their control over territory and trade, their ambitions increasingly collided. And around 3,100 years before the Common Era, one ruler emerged, claiming authority over both regions at once. The exact details of that unification remain debated among historians. But the outcome mattered more than any single name. A collection of competing river communities had become a single territorial kingdom, its ruler wearing the combined symbols of two lands that had once been rivals. A unified kingdom could now gather resources, labor, and loyalty on a scale no single village or province had ever commanded alone. The question was no longer whether Egypt could become one nation. It was how far that unity could be pushed. Once kingship, religion, taxation, and labor were all bound into a single system, answering to one throne. That system did not stay still for long. In the centuries following unification, Egypt's rulers began translating political power into something that could be seen from a great distance, and at Saqqara, a royal tomb built for the king, Djoser, rose in stepped tiers of dressed stone, the first monument of its kind, and a clear signal that kingship in Egypt now had ambitions beyond a single lifetime. A strong monarchy, reliable agricultural surplus, and an increasingly sophisticated administration made it possible to mobilize workers and specialists on a scale that earlier generations could not have attempted. And stone itself became a new language of royal authority, built to endure across generations rather than fade with a single reign. That ambition reached its peak during the Fourth Dynasty, when royal builders achieved a level of logistical mastery that culminated in the towering pyramids at Giza. Quarrying, river transport, food provisioning, and the coordination of enormous rotating labor forces all had to function in near-perfect harmony, and modern historians increasingly connect these achievements less to any single genius and more to a state exercising extraordinary central control over its own wealth and population. A pyramid was never simply a tomb. It was the visible tip of an entire administrative system, dependent on quarry workers hauling limestone, boats moving cargo along the river, scribes recording every delivery of grain and every rotation of labor, priests maintaining royal cults, and a state permanently dedicated to sustaining those cults long after a king had died. Kingship and monument had become physically inseparable, each reinforcing the other in the eyes of anyone who saw the Giza plateau rising from the desert. But the very success of this system carried the seeds of its own transformation. As the state grew larger and its responsibilities multiplied, provincial governors, temple estates, and regional officials increasingly took on authority and resources that had once flowed almost exclusively through the royal court. This was not necessarily incompetence or catastrophe. It was the natural consequence of running an increasingly complex kingdom, where permanent institutions needed land, priests, and administrators of their own to function. The very apparatus that had made monumental construction possible was quietly loosening the exclusivity of royal control, spreading authority outward even as the Great Pyramids themselves stood finished and unmoving on the plateau. The pyramids survived. The political machine that had built them did not remain equally strong. Yet the weakening of central authority would not simply destroy Egyptian society. It would scatter power across the Nile Valley, forcing Egyptians to discover, for the first time, whether their kingdom could survive without an all-powerful center holding every province in place. For a time, it could not, at least not in the old form. As central authority weakened in the later years of the Old Kingdom, resources and legitimacy increasingly settled into regional hands rather than the royal court. A shift that likely combined institutional redistribution with broader environmental pressures on the Nile's yearly floods. Though historians today are careful not to blame any single drought for what followed. Egypt was no longer governed effectively from one throne, but it did not simply disappear. Local rulers and regional centers stepped into the space the crown had once filled, organizing their own resources, their own labor, and their own claims to legitimacy. This is the first great irony at the heart of Egyptian history. The collapse of centralized power did not mean the collapse of Egyptian civilization. Life along the Nile continued, only reorganized around new centers of authority rather than a single capital. Two of these centers eventually rose above the rest: Thebes in the south and a rival power based near Heracleopolis in the north, each claiming a share of what had once been a unified kingdom. What had been one Egypt became several competing Egypts, locked in a slow struggle over who would eventually reunite the Nile Valley under a single crown. That struggle ended when a Theban ruler named MinutesThe II extended his authority northward at the start of the second millennium before the Common Era, defeating his rivals and reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt under Theban rule. Out of that victory came the Middle Kingdom, a centralized Egypt once again, but not an identical copy of what had come before. Under the 12th dynasty, the state built a more mature and flexible administration, shifted its royal center farther north, and expanded Egyptian influence and trade southward into Nubia with new fortresses and garrisons. Provincial elites, who had grown accustomed to building monuments of their own during the years of fragmentation, continued to leave their mark on the landscape, even as royal power reasserted itself above them. And soldiers, scribes, and workers now lived and labored in fortified outposts far beyond the traditional heartland of the Nile Valley. Egypt had broken apart and rebuilt itself, but the rebuilt kingdom now reached farther, beyond its old borders, than it ever had before, engaging more directly with peoples and territories to its south. Reunification under MinutesThe II had proven something that would define Egyptian history for the next 3,000 years. Political collapse was not an ending, only a prelude to reconstruction. But no reconstruction lasts forever. As central power weakened once again in the centuries that followed, the Eastern Delta grew increasingly connected to populations arriving from Western Asia. And the next fragmentation of Egypt would change something deeper than administration. It would change the way Egypt made war. By the 17th century, before the Common Era, Middle Kingdom authority had declined once more, and different dynasties came to control different regions of Egypt at the same time. In the Eastern Delta, populations of Western Asian origin, long settled in the region through generations of trade and migration rather than sudden conquest, rose to political power as the Hyksos dynasty, dominating Lower Egypt, while Theban rulers held on in the south, and the powerful kingdom of Kerma controlled territory farther up the Nile. Unified Egypt had disappeared for a second time, and for the first time since unification, a ruling dynasty of foreign origin controlled part of the Nile Valley. Facing rival powers to both the north and the south, Theban rulers gradually turned political fragmentation into open warfare, launching campaigns northward against Hyksos territory. Around 1550 years before the Common Era, the Theban king, Ramesses I, finally defeated Hyksos power and brought Egypt back under unified rule, an achievement built on sustained military expansion rather than a single decisive battle. With that victory, the new kingdom began, and with it came the most important transformation in this entire story. Egyptian rulers no longer accepted the old assumption that controlling the Nile Valley alone was enough to guarantee security. Ramesses' successors pushed outward into Nubia and into Western Asia, converting what had once been vulnerable borderlands into controlled territory and buffer zones. Security, once defined by geography alone, now meant depth, meant reach, meant projecting force far beyond the river that had once been Egypt's natural shield. Foreign campaigns brought tribute, resources, and prestige flowing back into the Nile Valley, and soldiers who had once served close to home now marched hundreds of kilometers into unfamiliar territory. Nubian gold and goods from across Western Asia increasingly moved through Egyptian temple and palace economies, and the great temple of Amun-Re at Thebes expanded alongside royal power itself, its growing halls, a visible sign that empire, religion, and kingship had become tightly bound together. Egypt had once protected its wealth by hiding behind desert and river. Now it would protect that wealth by controlling territory beyond its own borders. Within a few generations, the kingdom that had been born beside a single river would become one of the dominant powers of the ancient world, its influence stretching from Nubia in the south to the eastern Mediterranean in the north. That success would generate the wealth and the tensions that defined ancient Egypt's most dramatic and contradictory era. Under the 18th dynasty, that outward reach intensified as military campaigns and careful diplomacy extended Egyptian influence deep into Nubia and much of the Levant, with rulers such as Thutmose, the third leading forces that placed Egypt at the center of an international system of competing great powers. Tribute, trade, and diplomatic exchange poured extraordinary wealth into the Nile Valley, and Egypt's royal court became a destination for foreign delegations bearing luxury goods from across the known world. Within this system, one ruler demonstrated just how adaptable Egyptian kingship could be. Hatshepsut, who came to power first as regent and then as pharaoh in her own right, ruled through the same visual and religious language that had always represented Egyptian kings, proving that the institution of kingship could accommodate a female sovereign without abandoning its ancient symbolism. Her reign renewed long-distance trade, including a celebrated expedition to the land of Punt, and produced one of Egypt's most striking monuments at Deir el-Bahri. As wealth from empire continued flowing inward, much of it settled into the hands of the gods, and above all into the temple of Amun-Re, whose halls at Karnak expanded generation after generation under royal patronage. Here lies a quieter irony beneath the grandeur. By enriching divine institutions to demonstrate their own power, pharaohs also built permanent religious institutions whose wealth and influence could easily outlive any single king who funded them. It was against this backdrop that Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, attempted the most radical transformation in Egyptian religious history, elevating the sun disk Aten above the traditional pantheon, founding an entirely new capital at Akhenaten, and overseeing a striking shift in royal art and ritual. The full details of daily life and politics during this period remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and historians are cautious about describing this as the sudden invention of a single unified faith across all of Egypt. What is clear is that the court, its art, and its rituals moved sharply away from long-established patterns for a brief but intense period. That revolution did not survive its author. After Akhenaten's death, the royal court gradually returned to traditional worship, and under Tutankhamun and his successors, the position of Amun was restored, while Akhenaten was abandoned and later dismantled, its stones eventually reused elsewhere. Egyptian religious and political institutions had proven more durable than any single ruler's ideological ambitions. The next phase of New Kingdom power belonged to Ramesses II, whose reign combined monumental building with military competitions against other great powers of the age. Most famously at the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire. That confrontation showed the limits of even Egypt's formidable military reach. Rather than achieving total dominance, Egypt eventually settled into a formal peace with the Hittites as the wider balance of power across the region shifted. Decades later, Ramesses III successfully defended Egypt against the disruptive incursions of the Sea Peoples. Yet in the years following his reign, Egyptian power gradually contracted rather than collapsed outright. New Kingdom Egypt had survived invasion, expanded into empire, and even weathered a religious revolution from within. But survival was not the same as maintaining supremacy. As imperial reach shrank, different institutions and regional elites steadily accumulated power of their own, setting the stage for a transformation that would move in the opposite direction from everything that had come before. Not expansion beyond the Nile, but fragmentation within it. In the centuries after Ramesses XI, kings ruling from the north increasingly shared authority with powerful high priests of Amun based at Thebes, and eventually dynasties of Libyan origin rose to claim the throne itself. Pharaonic symbolism endured, but genuine political authority had become diffused across competing regions and rival families, rather than concentrated in a single royal court. Meanwhile, in territory Egypt had once dominated as an imperial frontier, an independent Kushite kingdom grew steadily in strength to the south, and Kushite rulers eventually intervened directly in Egyptian affairs, establishing the 25th dynasty, and ruling not as foreign conqueror indifferent to Egyptian tradition, but as kings who engaged deeply with Egyptian religious and royal customs. Territory that Egypt had once controlled as a subject frontier was now producing rulers for the Egyptian throne itself. Egypt's position in the wider world was also changing in ways it could no longer control. When Assyrian forces intervened in Egyptian affairs, it became clear that Egypt was no longer the uncontested power projecting force outward into Asia. Now, expanding empires from Asia could invade the Nile Valley in return. After Assyrian withdrawal, native Kushite rulers managed to restore a stronger, more unified Egyptian government, but that recovery proved temporary against the rising power of Persia. In 525 before the Common Era, the Achaemenid Persian Empire conquered Egypt outright, absorbing the Nile Valley into an imperial system controlling territory and resources on a scale no fragmented Egyptian state could hope to match. Egyptians briefly regained independence generations later, only for Persia to reconquer the country in 343 before the Common Era. And yet, through every one of these transitions, something remarkable persisted. Foreign rule did not mean that Egyptian religion, ritual, and visual language simply disappeared. Conquering rulers repeatedly adopted pharaonic titles, continued funding traditional temples, and found that governing Egypt effectively meant working within Egyptian forms of legitimacy rather than replacing them outright. Delta cities increasingly held mixed communities of Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, and others, with foreign mercenaries and merchants becoming a visible part of daily life under Kushite rule, pulling Egypt ever more tightly into the wider economy of the Mediterranean world. Imperial decline had weakened centralized Egyptian control, inviting intervention from larger and more powerful neighbors. But conquest after conquest failed to erase the underlying institutions of Egyptian civilization. Rulers of every origin kept discovering the same lesson. Governing Egypt meant speaking, at least in part, its ancient political and religious language. For centuries, Egypt had confronted a rotating cast of foreign rulers who nevertheless operated within Egyptian traditions. Then, in 332 before the Common Era, another conqueror arrived, and this time, conquest would redirect Egypt's future not south along the Nile or east toward old rivals, but north, across the Mediterranean itself. Alexander of Macedon conquered Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, ending Persian rule as Persian imperial power crumbled before his advancing armies, and folding the Nile Valley into an entirely new Hellenistic political order. A new royal center soon rose at Alexandria, oriented toward the Mediterranean rather than the traditional heartland, upriver, cosmopolitan in character, and heavily shaped by Greek language and culture. After Alexander's death, His general Ptolemy and his descendants established a dynasty that would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, ruling a kingdom that operated, in effect, in 2 languages at once. At court in Alexandria, Greek culture and administration dominated almost completely. Yet within Egypt's ancient temple towns, Ptolemaic kings portrayed themselves as pharaohs, in the fullest traditional sense, performing Egyptian religious rites and financing monumental temple construction in established Egyptian forms. Egyptian civilization no longer determined the ethnicity of the person sitting on the throne, but it still shaped how that power had to be represented to be considered legitimate. The last major ruler of this hybrid kingdom was Cleopatra VII, whose reign became entangled in the civil wars, tearing apart the Roman Republic. Her alliance with Mark Antony ended in defeat at the Battle of Actium, and in 30 years before the Common Era, Roman forces annexed Egypt outright, ending the last pharaonic dynasty and folding the Nile Valley into the growing Roman world. Alexandria embodied a genuine cultural fusion, while older temple towns along the river continued rituals reaching back many centuries. 2 worlds existing side by side rather than one abruptly replacing the other. Political independence had ended, but cultural tradition did not vanish overnight along with it. The pharaohs were no longer independent rulers of Egypt. But if 30 years before the Common Era truly marked the death of ancient Egyptian civilization, its temples, its gods, its writing, and its architecture should have disappeared along with the throne, they did not. Return today to Giza after the sun has fully risen, and beyond the pyramids stretches a modern country utterly transformed from the society that first raised those stones. Yet the stones remain, and they are far from alone. Across Egypt, temple complexes, tomb landscapes, obelisks, and sacred sites reused across successive eras still stand, along with cities built in layers above much older settlements and artistic traditions, whose visual language survived one ruling dynasty after another. Ancient Egypt endured for more than 3,000 years, not because it remained unchanged, but because its institutions and its cultural language kept adapting to change without breaking entirely. Its monarchy collapsed more than once. Foreign rulers repeatedly took its throne. Its religious order was challenged from within by its own king. Its empire eventually disappeared, and its political independence was ultimately lost to Rome. Yet every transformation carried forward pieces of what had come before it, from Nile settlements that created centralized kingship, to a kingship that created monumental state power, to a collapse that forced reinvention, to an invasion that created an empire, to an empire that generated the very vulnerabilities that would eventually undo it. Egypt's greatest monument was never any single pyramid rising above the desert. It was the ability of a civilization to rebuild the meaning of what it meant to be Egyptian, again and again, while insisting, through every collapse and every conquest, that it was still Egypt.